Hello there, it's Tom and Magnolia here, and this is one of the side stories from Gunnerkrigg Court called Coyote.
Hi there.
So for this side story, I didn't intend for it to be online. I wanted it to just be print only and then eventually collected into the side stories Beyond the Walls book that I was going to do. But as of the time of recording this video, we are currently in the middle of the 2020 coronavirus pandemic, and I thought it would be fun to put it online for people to read just for a bit of extra content. And so I figured it'd be good to do a video for it as well.
I'm looking forward to it.
So just to explain what this is really, I'd always found the myth of Coyote really interesting, and the fact that he's in Gunnerkrigg, which is set in England, is kind of a strange point in the story itself. And I'd always had an idea in mind for the circumstances around why Coyote ended up coming to the court. And this story is, I suppose you could call it an origin story of sorts. It's basically his journey around the world, meeting other dog myths, and changing his body until he eventually becomes the Coyote that we see in the main story.
Did you have a hard time coming up with how Coyote would look before he changed, or was that pretty natural?
It was kind of natural, but I really wanted him to still kind of look like Coyote, but actually look more like a coyote, whereas in the main story, he looks nothing like a coyote, really. And so at the beginning of this, he just looks like a regular dog bumming around the desert. And I kind of wanted a lot of it to seem sort of mundane, despite all the fantastical stuff that really happened and the context of the story, as we'll see a little bit later. So, for example, right here at the beginning, Coyote's doing something that seems mundane. He's just pushing a couple of rocks together whilst he's messing around in the desert. But he's actually also creating life here. And we'll see later on that the ants are more than just ants. And so this one that he's created himself is just a little nod towards the shadow men that he is claimed to have created.
So this story is told a little bit more like a folktale or a myth.
Yeah, and the beginning of the story is one of the aspects I really like about the Coyote stories, in that it's the other animals tricking Coyote himself and kind of playing up to his vanity and confidence because they're trying to fool him. And we see that, they're trying to get him to leave where they are because he keeps messing with them. And we get a little hint in the difference between the Coyote in my story and, I guess, the traditional Coyote stories, in that he seems to be capable of doing many things at once and not limiting his being to one thing at a time, if that makes sense. So he runs away, but then also decides to stay back and continue messing with the creatures back at his home. So his powers are so limitless that he's able to do something like that. And this is just an indication that my Coyote kind of exists on a level where just thinking of something will allow it to happen.
I remember I had a book of Coyote stories when I was a kid, and it's true, he was often tricked by the other animals. Sometimes even hurting himself or making a fool of himself, kind of like he talks about Sangren being the butt of the joke in a lot of his stories.
Yeah, and that is one of the common themes that sort of unite a lot of these stories together, and one of the reasons why I wanted to focus on dog myths is there's a lot of overlap between the different myths from very different parts of the world. And that's why Coyote refers to Renard as his cousin, really, because, in mythical terms, they are roughly equivalent of each other. In Renard's story, Sangren tends to be the butt of the joke, but in Coyote's story, Coyote is often the butt of the joke as well as the antagonist, and it was the way that Coyote can be so different from story to story that sort of gave me the idea of making his personality so strange and the way that he finds enjoyment in really strange activities. So the story really kicks off now when Coyote decides to leave his home and travel the world looking for these mythical dogs that the crow has told him are stronger and faster and more beautiful than he is. And here we see that even though he looks like a dog just hopping over a little river here, if you look up close, I did try and keep the landscape of the mountains and stuff true to the layout of the world, really. You can see right down here is England and France and Spain, and leading down to Africa down here, and then this leads over to the Indian subcontinent, because his first stop is going to be in India, and he meets Sarama, the mother of all dogs. And in keeping with trying to make this sort of a fairy tale story, the creatures that he meets are going to be in the order that the crow has referenced them: faster, fiercer, more beautiful and strong than him. So the first one that he meets, Sarama, is the fastest of all dogs.
Is Sarama in myth fast, or did you choose that for her?
No, that's part of her original creation, is that her name is a reference to her being fleet-footed, I guess they call it, or calling her the runner. And so I took that to be the inspiration to make her the one Coyote meets who's faster than he. And each of the traits that the crows mentioned, the speed and the strength and how attractive a dog is, I kind of kept in mind that might be stuff that is important to creatures like these, And so we see that just by realizing that he himself should be fast, he then makes himself fast. And I start to show that each of his powers can be visually represented, like we see here that he's getting these wraps around his legs, kind of like Sarama has. And that we've come to know as part of Coyote's design in Gunnerkrigg is that he has these sort of wrappings around his legs. And so just by willing it, he obtains them himself and is able to easily keep up with and even outrun Sarama just because he wanted it.
So did you always have in mind that those disparate elements of Coyote's design would represent different parts of his power, or is this something you came up with for this story?
I did keep that in mind for when I was designing him originally, especially because, as we'll see later, the representation of his strength is that red stripe down his back, which is then something that he's able to remove and then give to somebody. And in the same way that we see him sort of like remove a tooth and give that to somebody, and that it's either represented as a sword or sharpness in some way. These are parts of himself that have a physical presence that can be given away, and counter to that, he's obtained these for himself during the story. And so, because Sarama is the mother of all dogs, she mentions that she has a son who, I guess, since she's the mother of every dog, Coyote is also her son, but, again, the rules of physics don't really apply here. But she does mention that one of her sons is much more fierce than Coyote is, which is the next trait that the crow has mentioned. And it's also, I guess, a little bit to make Coyote leave her alone. So she points over to the east, which over in Japan, where Inugami lives, who is a very fierce dog creature. And so Coyote heads over there.
Was it fun to research and design all these dog creatures?
Yeah, it was. And that's really my favorite part of working on the comic in general, is doing the research and reading lots of stories from all around the world and then interpreting them for use in the story. So I like to go and read as much about the subject that I'm looking into and then take elements that I find interesting and use them together and try and make something unique that still calls back to the original lore, And so when it came to the design of Inugami, one of the things that I like best about looking at the really old pictures of Japanese monsters and creatures and myths is their eyes are always really striking and very piercing. And so when it came to Inugami being more fierce than Coyote, it's not that he has big teeth or he has big claws or anything like that. The aspect that I wanted to make interesting for this guy is that he has eyes all over his body and they're looking in different directions and they're sort of very striking and piercing. And so that is what Coyote takes from that. And that's the reason why he seemingly has these markings that represent his eyes all over his body, and they actually are his eyes as well,
I wasn't sure if they were real eyes or not.
Yeah, they can be and they can also not be, It's just the way that he is. And so Inugami himself, I wanted to keep away from trying to make him or any of the other mythical creatures really look super cool, if you know what I mean, like cool in a modern design sensibility. I wanted to keep some of them looking a little goofy, and really Inugami looks a bit goofy, and one of my favorite pictures of Inugami is one of the older ones that exists, and he's a really cool looking character, but he does look a little goofy, so I wanted to sort of maintain that.
Yeah, you didn't want it to be like video game cool or something.
Exactly, yeah. And so now that Coyote has decided to be more fierce and more scary, Inugami also wants to shrug him off and get him off his island, so he directs him towards the African continent where the Lycaons are.
So, is this a folktale about the wild dogs that live in Africa?
Yeah, these are the African wild dogs, and I'm sure they're not called Lycaons by everyone in Africa. I'm sure there's lots of different names for them, and there's also lots of different myths, and I couldn't find any one specific myth that was, say, the equivalent of Coyote or Inugami, where there is just one creature that represents them. It just seemed, from what I could tell, it seems that they are part of mythology, and my research can only really go so far, so I tried to just take the idea of them as creatures that exist and some of the traits that they're known for. And one of the things that I like about them most, which I think is most evident, is the way they look, really, their markings on them and their fur and their coat, and that is what Coyote finds interesting about them too.
So when you first designed Coyote, were his markings inspired by these creatures?
In all honesty, no, not really. When I first designed Coyote, I stuck to a lot of reference images from the original Coyote depictions of him, and I wanted to make the lines on him kind of representative of his position in the mythology. So I always imagined the blue on his face being the rivers, that he exists in, and his teeth are the rocks. And from there, kind of, I eventually ended up with a design. But when it came to doing the story here, I thought it was just fine to show that not only did he like the idea of giving himself really striking and bold lines, but it was actually looking at them hunting in a pack that made him realize, that maybe it might be fun to have a pack of his own, somebody to pal around with, I suppose. And so, but as usual, Coyote gets tricked. The Lycaons tell him that there's a really strong creature that lives over in the island, which is Australia. And so he hops over there.
And the Bunyip isn't specifically a dog, is it?
No, he's not. It seems to be of no particular shape, really, the legend of the Bunyip. And that's what I wanted to incorporate, that he may not even be a dog, really, and Coyote's not sure. But in all the research that I did for him, he seemed to be a very intimidating and very dangerous creature. So upon finding the Bunyip, the first thing that happens is that she punches Coyote in the face and sends him flying up into orbit. And Coyote loves it because this shows that the Bunyip really is strong. And Coyote chooses to have that for himself too. And that's the big red stripe that he has on his back. And then finally, Coyote lands somewhere where there is a lot of dog creatures. So he's actually in Europe and the British Isles here.
So now we have Coyote's basically final design, right? But you did change it a little bit for black and white, didn't you?
Yeah, his colours are sort of inverted because it's in black and white. And I guess Coyote would probably know that because he's not in colour here, he has to alter his colours a little bit. So I just went with what was most readable.
Right.
So as he goes around looking for a pack of his own, he comes across the old tale of Sangren having his tail stuck in the ice.
So this kind of brings up the question of these events are not exactly literal.
Well, that's a good question, because the way I think of it is that the events, they are and they are not literal at the same time. Like, the stuff that's going on is really happening outside of what humans would consider either their dimension or their time frame or
perception.
Yeah, or even their perception, yeah. So the events of this comic and the events of any myth really is just the feeble human mind trying to make sense of what's happening, So even here, when Sangren is trying to explain why his tail is stuck in the ice, it's seen from a different point of view, from a different style, because all this stuff is happening at very different times and in different circumstances, and even with different characters, really. But each of the characters in this are aware of it and they're part of it, and they're also separate from it at the same time. It's kind of just something I keep in mind to make the creatures cohesive, but also vague in a way, if that makes sense.
No, sure.
And I guess if you were to ask Coyote about it, he would probably just say, don't think about it too much, Like, everything that needs to happen to tell his story is happening, and if something needs to change, then he'll change it.
I guess that kind of explains why Sangren loves and respects Coyote so much, because Coyote can be part of all this without it bothering him, really.
And of course, yeah. I mean, it's extremely powerful and dangerous ability, and it's part of the reason why Sangren thinks that Coyote is too aloof about it and he doesn't really take it seriously. But here, sadly for Sangren, he mentions Renard, and Coyote is much more interested in Renard than he is in crummy old Sangren, so he basically enlists his help to go and find him. And along the way, he tells a few stories of the dog creatures that live here in the British Isles and Europe. And he tells the story of how Renard is mainly known for his cunning and his trickery, and that speaks to Coyote, because, of course, Coyote believes himself to be extremely cunning and tricky.
Do you feel that your Renard kind of doesn't live up to that in his own mind?
Yeah, actually, the original Renard from the stories of Renard is more of a trickster and, a sort of gadabout and much closer to Coyote. And the Renard that's in my story, kind of in the same way that the Coyote in my story is personality-wise distinct from the original Coyote, I wanted the Renard in my story to be kind of at a different stage of his life. And here we see him looking down at these ants and just watching them, and we realize that these ants are actually a depiction of humans. The Renard that is present here and present in my story is really somebody who has spent a long life life, interacting in ways, and probably in his youth, as it were, did trick a lot of people, and, you know, he caused a lot of mischief. But this Renard is more content to kind of just watch the things around him, and he's a lot more passive and more pensive about things, and which is why he's not really interested in the powers that Coyote offers him, because he understands that he's in a position where he kind of has everything that he needs, you know what I mean? Like power and strength wise, and he's just content to continue just observing the things around him rather than messing with things. So
it's kind of like he's a Renard who's matured past the trickster stage.
Yeah, kind of. That's how I always imagined him.
That's cool. This depiction of humans casts Renard falling in love with Surma in sort of a different light, doesn't it?
Well, a little bit, but I think that might be looking at it too literally. Because just because we're seeing these as ants doesn't mean that these guys are seeing them as ants or that they are ants at all. You know, it's sort of like a fairy tale story of, I don't know, let's say a fox falling in love with the moon kind of thing. You know, it's probably not an indication of the physical attributes or what are attractive. It's the idea of what the thing is, you know.
Sure, but it does kind of make you understand Sangren's feelings a bit more.
Yeah, so Sangren, he probably does see them as nothing more than ants. Obviously, Coyote and Renard see them as much more than that, and we'll see later on that they are capable of much more. But Sangren, you know, he is, of the three of them, like the least mature, really. You know, even less mature than Coyote, and he's just brash and kind of powerless and kicks out in his sort of impotence, I suppose, which kind of gets him a reprimand from Coyote.
Did you have fun drawing this?
I did, yeah. I love big splash pages like this where I don't have to keep Coyote on model or anything, you know, and I'm just trying to show a moment in big up-close detail. But this really sets up the situation that Sangren, Renard and Coyote are in when Annie meets them and we meet them as readers in the story, where they've come together and they're not particularly close in terms of their relationship. And Renard has always seemed kind of separate from Coyote and Sangren, who've stayed back in the forest, whereas Renard is content to go off and almost be captured by the court and be content being just a stuffed toy that is, you know, under the control of Annie in the main story. And just to finish off, I guess, the setup for the situation that Coyote finds himself in, he comes across the endeavor that the humans are having, which is a depiction of the court. And here we see that he just very casually scrapes a line in the sand, and we can see that in our human perception that manifests as him ripping a giant ravine in the landscape, you know.
So, not to take it too literally again, but what is interesting to me about this is it casts that event in a different light, because in the comic it's shown to be like a way of stopping the humans and animals from fighting, but here it's almost like he did it for Renard's benefit even.
Oh, well, yeah. I mean, he's kind of doing it for their own benefit and his own benefit. He's making these kind of arbitrary rules. But in creating the line in the ground and the ravine, he is sort of stopping the interaction from any other mythical shenanigans that might be going on, you know, and he is also separating the forest from the court here. But he's doing it in such a casual way that to him it doesn't really matter, or that he doesn't really have to think about the act of doing it, no matter what the consequences are in real life. It's just the situation that he's setting up so that he can stay with his crummy little pack here and watch the humans toiling away in front of him.
Well, I know it's not the point, but they all look cute sitting there together.
Yeah, and here really they do look like small dogs just sort of huddled together, and the ants, which are so much smaller than these creatures, have created something that is larger than these mythical creatures that we've seen do incredible things up until now. And that is really the feel that I wanted to get across with this story, and also how the court is built, and probably give a little hint as to the endeavour as to what the people of the court are trying to do, and what makes Coyote so interested. But that is that. The story of Coyote and how he came to Gunnerkrigg Court. So come back again for more videos, and I'll see you next time.
Bye!